Welcome to the video. I thought I would share my data for 2020 on the Monarchs. It was a very good year. I wasn't planning on capturing data until about September 1st for two reasons. One, I had a tachinid fly issue. And two, I wanted to see if you could discriminate between the normal generations and the super monarchs that travel back to Mexico. I began to collect some weight and other information to see if I could differentiate one generation from the other. You can see some of the data here, eclosed by day and by gender. There was about 150 butterflies for the month of September. 150 males and 150 females, so about 300. And I was interested in what was going on with these tachinid issues. I was also keeping track of where I might lose a chrysalis, whether it be for monodons, some that were nibbled on by the other caterpillars. And I did take a lot of action on September 1st to tackle that issue, and it looks like maybe it did pay off in the end. Also, this year was interesting in that the first monarch arrived May 4th, a monarch from Mexico. And this is the first time this has ever happened, at least in the last 5 years. I'm fairly north of Delmarva. So maybe this would have been a clue that it was going to be a bigger year than usual. The other thing I captured data on was OE. I have by cage. The blue bar shows how many eclosed in cage number 1, for example, and how many had OE in that cage. The gray trend shows the percentage, and the percentage scale is on the right-hand side. So for example, cage 1, there was about 17, maybe 2 of them had OE, so it was a fairly low percentage, let's say 10% or so. The overall percentage is 22, so you see this line here. So some cages will have no OE whatsoever, so they're 0%. Some cages where there's only one butterfly and they have OE will be 100%. But you notice that cages that generally have more than one butterfly or one caterpillar in the cage will generally not hit the 100% mark. On average, you can see it's about 1/5 to 1/4 of them having OE. Caterpillars that were fed milkweed, homegrown, outdoors in the ground, near some plants that would attract other butterflies, such as a bee balm butterfly bush and joe pye. Generally, the way I feed the caterpillars in the cages is I pick some leaves off the milkweed plant, I put them in floral tubes and give them to the caterpillars. There's really no washing or rinsing. And I will generally try to remove most of the aphids. So this is sort of the same view on the OE by date. See the overall 22% line, which is that orange flat line. And you can see how many eclosed on a day and how many had OE. And the gray is the percent OE, so it'll start from 0% to 20%, for example, on September 2nd. And then September 3rd, there were 15. None of them had OE, so it jumps back to 0%, etc. And then there's a cumulative percentage shown in the black. You gradually build up over time, I guess up to the 22% overall. There's a fairly flat region here where it's kind of maintaining its own. And then there's a little bit of a bump here, especially on the 21st, September 21st. It seems there's a fairly high number of OE. And we'll take a look at the reason why that might have been. You can also see up top the number of butterflies that were eclosed, let's say 146 on each side, male and female. There were actually 29 of the females that had OE versus 37 of the males that had OE. It was about 20% of the females had OE and about 25% of the males had OE. So one thing to remember is that not all caterpillars in a cage will be infected with OE, even though they are all eating the same milkweed leaves. As mentioned before, there's a gentle increasing rate on this percentage of OE over the 30 days here of September. This could be due to an immune system issue as the days in September get colder and shorter, and we'll take a look at that. Of those with OE, none had deformed wings, and they were perfectly normal physically. Some of the data I was able to collect, I could look at things like weight versus OE. If you test the butterfly and you find that it has OE, you can have a true-false on infection. 1 being true that it is infected and 0 being that it's not infected. Here you can compare the weights of 223 butterflies that were not infected versus 58 that were. And you can compare the medians and the averages. So the average is shown with the X. The median is shown by this bar that you can barely see. When the medians and the averages for two population groups are fairly equal, fairly the same, usually it indicates that the OE is not really a factor in the weight of the butterfly. So the weight of the butterfly is a little bit difficult. It's a variable metric because butterflies lose about half their weight during the eclosed process. There's a lot of water that they shed during that process. So they continually dry over 24 to 48 hours. You're catching a falling knife, if you will, when you're trying to measure the weight of the butterfly. Since it is drying, it is dependent on the humidity. Most of the weights that I've captured were collected between 3 hours and 5 hours after eclose. Yeah, I have seen some videos where they mention 2 hours is long enough for the butterfly to dry. And I've found that usually you need at least 3 hours dry time because you really want the butterfly's weight to drop to an amount where it can actually fly and gain altitude. If it's too heavy or its wings are too non-rigid, they won't be able to fly very fast. You know, there could be some birds or wasps that find your butterfly interesting. You might want to give it the best shot and at least give it 3 hours, if not 4 hours. If it's a rainy day where it's going to be 100% humidity all morning, it's probably going to require 4 hours. Usually the humidity around here in the morning might drop 10% per hour if it's not raining, but it could be slower or faster. So 3 hours is a good rule of thumb if your humidity drops about 10% per hour. According to this data, it does not appear that an OE infection would affect the weight of the butterfly. Also here, there's a couple pieces of information about eclosed temperature. Median has been about 72 F, the most frequent. You can see over 60 butterflies eclosed around 72 degrees F, and then there's some variation from that. Also the humidity, the most frequent eclosed humidity is greater than 90%. More than 55 butterflies eclosed in that humidity region. 80% or so eclosed at greater than 80% humidity. We can also see that there is a difference in weight between the sexes. Males have a median weight of about 0.7 grams. This is 148 males versus 148 females with a median weight of 0.65 grams. Slightly lighter on the females. Most of these weights were again collected between 3 and 5 hours after eclose. We could generally say that the females are on average lighter than males. And they also have less weight variation. The box is smaller on the female side than on the male side. The populations are probably different because the mean for the females is almost at the bottom of this box for the males. So if we were to compare sex and OE to see that the males, these are the males with 0 OE versus the males with some OE, and you can compare the medians between these two groups. And of course there's a lot more in this group, 111 as opposed to the 37 in this group. But it would again seem the weight is not really affected when there's OE as opposed to no OE. And similarly for the two female groups. There's also a chart up here with the degree of OE, 0 being no OE and 4 being the most severe or super spreader. And you can sort of draw a line through here and see that as the OE increases, it doesn't seem to affect the weight or reduce the weight or increase the weight of the butterfly. And of course the most frequent occurrence was no OE followed by level 3 OE. So it's usually a binary where you usually have none or a lot. There's two other categories included here, where category 1 is where maybe there's a couple spores here and there. Category 2 is in between having a lot of scales that are completely covered, and 1 and 2 here and there. And then 4 is almost completely covered with OE. Another way to try and differentiate the supers from the regular generations is to measure size. Since weight is so variable, I thought the most reliable measurement seemed to be a measurement that from this hinge of the wing go along this main vein and go directly to the bottom of the wing. So you're kind of measuring right across here. On this example, it's about 33 millimeters. The most frequent values were these 4 here, between 32, 33, 34, and 35 millimeters for all 138 butterflies. That 80% of the data for the 80-20 rule, 80% of it basically includes these 4 sizes. Interestingly enough, there was a binodal situation where 32 was the most frequent with 35, and 34 was the next most frequent, followed by 33. Potentially, you could say maybe the supers are this curve, and the regular generation includes this curve, and put together they look like this. So that's maybe one way that you could separate the two generations. Although 33 would tend to have some of each, so 33 would be a size where you couldn't really tell which generation it might be. And if we look at the wing size by sex, we can see that they both still have the most frequent number at 33 millimeters. But the males tend to go a little bit on the higher side than the females do. This would look like it's a real phenomena, and it may account for the weight being slightly higher on the male side as well. Now, if we look at sex by size and how OE may have affected the wing size. I don't have a lot of data here because measuring the wing involves a lot of manipulation of the butterfly. And when your butterfly has OE, you don't really want to manipulate it. Towards the end of the season, I decided, well, I should probably collect like some data. And you can kind of see this phenomenon here where the OE butterflies tend to have a higher median wing size than the general population. The N is 5 and 10, much lower number of data points than the general population. Can't really tell if it affected the wing size. My guess is that it likely follows the weight trends, where the OE infection doesn't really affect the wing size. And actually no butterflies with OE had deformed wings. Especially this year, I've been really watching closely for any correlation between deformed wings and OE. We'll go into the reasons why I think the butterflies that did have deformed wings, why they might have had it, and it was not OE. Here is the most important part of this talk. If you look at the data of OE by day, here's every day of the month of September. And here's the OE severity from 0 to 4. There's a fairly low level of OE happening. And then there seems to be a step change happening here after the September 21st, September 20th time frame, which happens to coincide with some temperature variations. I did have temperature data when the butterflies eclosed. And so I overlaid that temperature data over the box plot on the OE by day. So the temperatures in red here are overlaid over the box plot for the OE by day. And you can see the step change in OE corresponds to some of the disruption in the temperatures. For the month of September, most of the temperatures remained above 60 for a period of time. And then around September 15th and 16th, the lows dropped to 50. Then they recovered to 60 for a day, and then they dropped all the way down to the 40s. And then eventually worked their way back up to around 60, around September 26th. On September 14th, these two nights were 52 degrees. They were the first 2 low degree nights in a very long time. I decided that the chrysalis would probably be okay remaining outside because I try to keep the caterpillars and the chrysalis outside as long as possible. I did bring the caterpillars in for those 2 nights, but I did leave the chrysalis outdoors, and they were exposed to that low temperature. When those chrysalis eclosed, they actually eclosed in the afternoon, which was the first time that had happened so far this season. Usually they always eclose in the morning. And it eclosed around 4 p.m., which is pretty late in the day actually. And this particular one did have OE. Based on that experience, I would avoid exposing chrysalis to temperatures below 60 degrees. And 60 degrees is where the minimum had been all the way through about September 15th. And then we had even a colder spell where the lows were 44 degrees. So that night, I did bring everything in, the caterpillars and the chrysalis. And I brought it in around 61 degrees off. Indoors, it was around 69. And I really wanted to avoid exposure to the low 40s and the 50s. So these were actually high estimates. They were really down in the low 40s and then the low 50s. And this is the first time I had 2 that eclosed on the same day with deformed wings, but neither of them had the OE. And these were the first 2 of the season and the only 2 of the season. So to me, it seemed that the deformed wings were related more to cold exposure rather than OE. Again, I saw the effect of the cold when the eclosed time was delayed into the afternoon as opposed to the normal morning. As you can see here, these red lines are actually temperatures when the butterflies eclosed, and even though they were within the house temperatures had dropped from the normal, let's say 70 to 72 range before the cold spell. They had dropped to the, all the way down to 62 at some point when some of the butterflies were eclosing. So I think this step change in the OE, even though it kind of peaked around the 21st and then seems to be coming back down, over time. These all may have been affected by that one cold spell for those 2 nights at 52. This would seem that the deformed wings may be more correlated to the chrysalis being exposed to low temperatures than to OE per se. The low temperatures may be stressing the immune system enough to allow OE to develop in more butterflies than it normally would if the butterflies were unstressed. For me anyways, I will be avoiding exposing the chrysalis to temperatures lower than 60. And I might even go as far as to maintain a floor of 72, as there was truly much less of a problem when the temperatures were, let's say, above 70. So if you have data that shows this effect, please share the data. If you have butterflies with deformed wings, if you can determine if they were exposed to low temperatures during the time they were in the chrysalis, that would be good information to know. And also, anytime you do have a deformed wing, make sure you test for OE just to be sure that it is correlated to OE.